Welcome to Northlandia, a place to bring your curiosity because here you'll find curiosities. I'm Wyatt Buckner of the Duluth News Tribune, and I'll be your guide as we discover the unique and fascinating stories here in the Northland. Here we celebrate the region's distinctive people, places, and history. In this episode, we head into the Marcel Experimental Forest to get a first-hand look at one of the experiments taking place there. Let's venture forth into Northlandia. In an experimental forest north of Grand Rapids, aluminum boardwalks stretch over a mossy bog connecting to several large, 26-foot-tall octagonal structures. This is the Spruce Project. To explain what's going on here, I'm joined again by arts and entertainment reporter Jay Gabler. Jay, welcome to episode 21 of the Northlandia podcast.
Pleased to be here with you in pursuit of science, truth, knowledge, all the usual things that we talk about in this podcast, right?
Oh yeah, definitely. We're definitely a very science-driven podcast. If you're new to the podcast, that is sarcasm. That's not usually our shtick. But don't worry, we'll tell you why. But first, tell me about how did you find out about this experiment and what made you want to learn about it? Because as we talked about before the podcast, your beat is arts and entertainment, not strictly speaking science, environment, and such. So how did you learn about it and what interested you about it to go outside of your typical beat area?
Yeah, I do have an interest in science. I studied social science in grad school and natural science to some extent as an undergrad. So I'm, fascinated with the scientific method, with technology. But what interested me in this story specifically was Atlas Obscura. I was browsing their guide to interesting sites in the Northland, want to see if they'd caught anything we hadn't. And sure enough, they had. They highlighted the Marcel Experimental Forest and specifically the Spruce Experiment. And once I saw the visuals of what looked like 10 biodomes popping up out of a Northland bog, I was like, we've got to get there. I need to see those domes.
And so what exactly is the Spruce Experiment?
So technically speaking, I should correct my initial impression, although it was what it looked like. It looked like they were doing like the Biosphere 2 style experiments or creating greenhouses or something. But actually these enclosures, they're about 26 feet tall and even wider from side to side, are open at the top. So imagine you're in the middle of this bog in a forest, and there's, as you were mentioning, Wyatt, sort of a boardwalk made of polycarbonate panels over an aluminum walkway. It's basically like a dock that you would take out onto a lake in the area. Well, they've got that stretching over the bog, connecting all these giant enclosures, and it's an experiment. And this is the kind of experiment that you could understand if you've ever done like a grade school science project, in the sense that it is absolutely classic. You've got your control, you've got your experimental cases, and you see how things turn out. So they've got these 10 enclosures, and what they are doing is they're enclosing large amounts of the ecosystem that was there when they built the enclosure. So bog ecosystem with moss and bushes and trees, and then some animal life kind of comes and goes. And then of course, all the peat below the surface and all the microorganisms that are there. So 10 times they enclosed all these, and they even have a couple where they built the octagons but didn't actually build the enclosures around them. So they're measuring a couple that aren't enclosed at all. And then what they're doing is varying the conditions within these different enclosures. And specifically what they're varying is the temperature and the level of carbon dioxide, because what they're trying to do is, well, you know what? I'm going to let experimenter Paul Hansen tell you himself. He was the scientist who we spoke with when we went out there.
Spruce stands for Spruce and Peatland Responses Under Changing Environmental Conditions, and it's basically a large field experiment designed to understand how a variety of warming conditions, some reasonable with respect to future projections and some beyond those levels of warming projections, to give us an idea of if an ecosystem like this, peatland, that contains an enormous amount of carbon, were to warm up to various future potential climates, what would happen to the nature of the vegetation and the amount of carbon stored in this system.
So Jay, let's talk briefly about our experience going into visiting, because you and I went up there last week to see it for ourselves. It was a lengthy drive, just around 2 hours. And first, talk to me about what was your initial expectation going in versus like what we actually encounter when we got there. I know there was kind of that science fiction-y angle to it. I know we jokingly talked about like, oh, we're going to come back changed from this experiment, kind of science fiction novel-esque, like we're visiting this remote experimental area.
I mean, the science fictional aspect of it did not disappoint. Absolutely, I felt like I was standing on a set for a 70s sci-fi movie like Silent Running or Soylent Green. It absolutely has that vibe. But whereas a lot of Northlandia stories, we talk about some quirky thing that's happening that some person just kind of spontaneously decides to do, that some, guy has in his garage, or something that someone has just spontaneously decided to do. This is a very serious, very deliberate, very carefully planned, very expensive government-funded science project. And so when you set foot on there, they want to protect you and they want to protect the science. And so there's a whole extended safety briefing with Kyle Pearson, another staffer at the project, and he let us know how we could stay safe in all sorts of different eventualities that could have come to pass. None of them did. We were fine. It was a good time. Nothing went wrong, but things can go wrong when you're in a forest and an experimental setting like this. So he gave us all the information we needed. Part that popped to me most was the possibility, again, didn't come to pass, to my knowledge, has not come to pass in this experiment, but could conceivably happen as well. They're varying the levels of carbon dioxide in these enclosures. So conceivably, it could happen that the carbon dioxide becomes unsafe for human breathing.
From a safety operations, understand that in some of our enclosures, it is possible for either CO2 levels to reach toxic concentrations, or more likely, we will no longer be able to guarantee what CO2 levels are. We have a number of fail-safes in place related to that. If something like that happens, there will be an alarm that goes off. There is a audible siren and a visual strobe light. It's very likely that my assistant, Mark Williams, and I will know in short order. We have a bunch of notification systems set up to let us know. But by all means, feel free to come let us know if that happens. If an enclosure enters a CO2 alarm condition, it's not like you need to run out because your life is in grave danger, but you will want to exit the enclosure in an orderly fashion.
It's probably good to appreciate the fact that they have these safety precautions in place. Looking at it, I would be extremely surprised if that were to come about, but it's good to know they have thought of the extremes just in case they could potentially happen. The chances are always low, but it's never zero. So it was interesting hearing. And that was just a small snippet of the fairly lengthy safety briefing, but that was probably the most interesting science-y, fiction-y kind of aspect of it, because I think I made note of that when we were walking through the structures and stuff and visiting them. I stepped outside, you could see the CO2 alarm there and the kind of the big panel along with it that I would imagine would trigger if an event were to occur.
Yeah, and this is a big, large-scale science project, so there were a lot of unknowns. We know how the world works, but it's a little bit like going to the moon. It's like you don't quite know what's going to happen when that lunar lander hits the surface. They didn't quite know what was going to happen when they turned on these environmental controls until they actually did. So it sounds like they really planned for all possible eventualities to protect the safety of everybody involved.
Mm-hmm. So I think it's probably safe to say this isn't the only kind of climate science experiment out there today. But how is this one different than other experiments of similar kind of nature?
Yeah, Paul Hansen explained that this is a very large-scale climate science project. So this is a lot different than what would be a lot easier, which is just taking a plant or two or some microorganisms and studying them in a lab. This allows them to do much more than you could do in a typical lab setting.
Back in the early 2000s, we developed a method for deep below ground soils warming that goes along with the air warming that you see in the chambers behind us in about that period of time. And that led us to propose doing large-scale whole ecosystem warming. Large-scale studies allow us to measure ecosystem responses at a level that captures the diversity that's in the system. Many other very useful studies of warming are done in petri dishes, in jars on the laboratory shelves, or using different methods in smaller plots. Oak Ridge's National Lab's goal was to take on an experimental system that encompassed the diversity of the system it was studying.
So in regards to that system that they are studying, how did they come about being in Minnesota for this experiment? Why is this experiment located in our backyard of the Northland?
Yeah, they were considering a lot of possibilities. They were considering various locations all over the place. The basic idea was they wanted a place where you could enclose large areas of the environment in these enclosures and, alter the environment within them to see what would happen. So that was the basic idea, but to make the most of this incredible expense and effort they went to, they ended up deciding that their best opportunity was here in the Northland.
There was a period of time where we thought we would do this experiment in the high elevation, closer to Oak Ridge, Tennessee, but in the high elevations of the Appalachian Mountains, where there the primary question wasn't so much carbon cycle as it was, as climates warm, the spruce fir forests that live on top of the Appalachian chain might run out of living space or living climate space. We couldn't find that space and that plot of ground to do that study, or we weren't find a group that was willing to let us come in and do what we've been able to do here. That led to various iterations and discussions that led us to discussions through the U.S. Forest Service to talk with the Marcel Experimental Research Group in 2009 here in Grand Rapids, Minnesota. And then it sort of just fell together. All of the pieces fit together and led us to begin the development of this process.
So we should probably take a moment to establish that this experimental forest was already here before. It's not like this appeared with the Spruce Project. It's been here prior to that, correct?
Yep. So the U.S. Forest Service has maintained this area within Chippewa National Forest for decades, since 1962, as a place that's sort of set aside and used for science observations. So we've known way back since the 60s, we wanted to observe the what happens in peatland watersheds within the kind of bog environment that we have in some areas here of northern Minnesota. So they've had this area set aside for science for a very long time. So when it came time to do the spruce experiment, they knew this would be available potentially as an area to come in and do a large-scale science project like this.
Mm-hmm. And what's interesting about it is, as my understanding, it's not really private property per se, in that, because he talked about how people would just kind of show up sometimes and just kind of wander the grounds. It's not even really locked off either. They kind of have this little gate thing that you could easily just walk around. I'm guessing it's there so that no one could drive anything big up there. So that's kind of interesting just to think about the idea that people just be kind of wandering around the grounds, and they kind of have poster boards set up as well so that you could have some reading material when you're walking around and seeing what on earth these dome-like things are.
Yeah, it's not exactly like a park. They do have a website we have linked on duluthnewstribune.com. You can go to find out the most information you can have before you go out to visit. But it is open to visitors. They do host members of the public as well as members of the media because, as you say, Wyatt, it's not private land. Mm-hmm. It's government land, and this is all largely government-funded research. Although it's conducted by Oak Ridge National Laboratory, it's funded by the U.S. Department of Energy, and so this is our taxpayer dollars going to work for this science. And so they want people to know what they're doing there.
Mm-hmm. And I feel like that kind of helps contribute to the idea that pulls us away from the science fiction aspect of it, in terms of when you go into this kind of story, it's secured off or whatever, we don't know what's going on there. So this kind of opens up a little, okay, it's less fictiony and more real in that regard.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, they're doing real science there. And it is, there are some precautions for safety reasons. And of course, they want to keep their, the integrity of the experiment and make sure that things aren't tampered with in that respect so that they can, get the data they need. But basically, the idea is they want people to know that this is happening. And really, your window to observe is just a couple years. But we'll talk about that a little later. Mm-hmm.
And in regards to safety, just to do our due diligence here, if you were to go out there, I recommend check out the website, maybe contact them ahead of time. But if you were to go out there, one thing I would note is that they have that metal boardwalk there. They noted that if you step off into the bog, it's deeper than it looks, apparently. They've reiterated that many times to us, so be very, very careful and stay on the metal boardwalk. Do not step off it.
Yeah, don't go tromping around in Minnesota's bogs, both for your safety and for the the safety of this somewhat fragile ecosystem, which was certainly something that was driven home by our visit to the spruce experiment. This is a rare in a sense and precious ecosystem.
Mm-hmm. And we've talked about the structures a few times now, but what do these enclosures do, and what do you see inside? And talk about how it feels.
It's hot. I mean, that's the whole point, right? They warm them up, and even in the enclosures that are not given added heat, it can feel a little bit warmer because you do get that greenhouse effect, right? You feel it's hot on your skin, and you feel air blowing on you, even in the enclosures where there's not heat added, because they want to keep things as similar as possible between, or at least among, the different enclosures. So if there's a fan blowing to add heat to one enclosure, they need to have a fan blowing without heat, but still moving air in the other enclosure. Paul Henson talked a little bit about what they are doing in these enclosures.
Department of Energy wants to know If we warm this to 5 different levels of warming, we have a zero energy added enclosure, which is our control, and then we have plus, and this is in degrees centigrade, plus 2.25, plus 4.5, plus 6.75, and a plus 9 degree C warming treatment. That plus 9 would be like 24 hours a day, 365 days a year. We've added 16 to 17 degrees Fahrenheit on top of what you're measuring, which, as you imagine, in August gets to be pretty hot. So independent of what the future might be 50 to 100 to 150 years out, this experiment is designed to have a enclosure system that gives us a glimpse at a plausible future for those temperatures.
And I'll reiterate what you said. It definitely feels hot in there, especially the plus 9 degrees Celsius one. That one felt particularly hot. I was pretty eager to get my footage and get out of there. I know I kind of banned you guys a little bit in there because I got hot in there. I wanted to get out. But then just to add in terms of like there's lots of equipment inside each of these domes as well. I don't know the names of all of them. One of them that I took note of was Paul referred to as a CO2 and methane flux chamber, and that one was like one that's like a circular. I have a photo of this in our story. That kind of opens and closes on a like incremental level, which I'm assuming is like capturing those gases of some capacity. I don't know. That's the part that kind of looked very science fiction-y to me, because like one of those things where it's like I got footage of it open, I looked away to get something else, I looked back, and all of a sudden it was closed, and then like 3 minutes later like reopened, and that was kind of, it's this little thing, but it's kind of cool to see those tools in play. What other things are kind of in each of those ones?
Yeah, that instrument you're mentioning, Wyatt, that's used to measure the gases that are coming off of the peatland. Because that's one of the huge questions that they're studying with this experiment, is finding out what is happening to the carbon that is trapped in the world's peatlands, which contain apparently a third of the world's sort of terrestrial carbon. And in a warming world, what's going to happen to that carbon? Is it going to stay in the peatland, which is kind of where we want it, given that we already have a problem with too much carbon in the atmosphere, or is it going to be released as the peatland warms? So that's what they're studying with that one. But yeah, these enclosures are just full of all sorts of different instruments. And you definitely get the impression that scientists know they've like spent this money, they've built these enclosures, you only get to run this once. And so they're capturing as much data as they possibly can. The trees are wrapped in silver to measure their water use. There are antennas all over, there are wires all over. There are little tubes that run through the ground, and they actually have little robot cameras that crawl along those tubes to photograph the root systems, so you can compare how the trees and other plants' root systems change over time. Just all sorts of instruments to make sure that they're really capturing all the data they can from this experiment.
That would have been really cool to get footage of that little robot rolling around. That would have been cool. That would have felt the most science fiction part of this whole thing if I was able to get footage of that.
I'll tell you what, you and I are both Star Wars fans. Jawas would make quick work of one of these enclosures. They would. Yeah. There's so much they could throw into a sand crawler if they were allowed access to one of these.
Yeah, they'd go wild. So how long has this experiment been going on for, and how long will it continue to go on for? Like, what's the whole timeline look like for this?
We weren't right on top of this news, Wyatt. It has been going on for a while, and will continue for just a couple more years, as Paul Hansen explained.
Well, we did start whole ecosystem warming treatments in the late fall of 2015, and we've been operating our experiment as intended throughout 2016 through to date. So we're into our 8th year, but we've been operating for 7.5 years. And the intention is that we would complete a decade of experimental manipulation. So the end of this study is projected or proposed to be the end of the calendar year 2025.
Yeah, it's interesting how this kind of slid under the radar, so to speak, a little bit. I know it's had media coverage for sure, but I certainly never heard of this project being here until you shared it with me first a few weeks ago from the article that you found.
Yeah, it's not the kind of thing that like fits into easy boxes of media coverage or things that people are interested in or go out and do. I mean, it's secluded, it's sort of hidden away by design. It is a complicated process, although it's not hard to understand what they're doing. But yeah, they've been at it for quite a while and have received a fair bit of attention locally for it.
Mm-hmm. And, seeing as they're not done with the experiment yet, but they're definitely closer to finishing than they were from starting now. So they're fairly far in right now. What have they found so far from this experiment?
Well, the news is not good, Wyatt. It's a little early to have results completely finished, finalized, and they're studying so many different things. It's not like they're going to have one answer and it's like, okay, that's it. That's the answer we're looking for. They're studying the plant growth, they're studying the microbes, they're studying the effects of the temperature change and the carbon dioxide change on all sorts of aspects of these ecosystems within these enclosures. And so already this experiment has spawned all sorts of different studies and will continue to spawn many more. So the ultimate results will be very complex. But what we know so far is that, surprise, surprise, when you heat up the earth, things do not go well for our ecosystem, and specifically for this bog ecosystem. Paul shared the most troubling finding, which refers to what happens to the carbon.
All of the levels of warming we have lead to lost carbon from this system. Now, that doesn't mean the peatlands is disappearing, it means it's changing. All of the shrub communities are doing quite well. There is a forb, a small bog lily that doesn't like the warming, and the sphagnum moss does not like the warming treatments whatsoever. So the sphagnum is showing lower productivity and actually disappearing proportionate to the warming treatments. And below ground, the microbial systems are being turned on by warming. They're more active, and that's leading to more loss of CO2 and disproportionately more losses of methane.
So not exactly the results that one would hope for, but also it's not horribly surprising given the state of things and how climate change is referred to these days.
Yeah, I don't think the scientists were shocked. I did not get the impression that they were shocked by what they are seeing in these warmed environments, but now they have the data. It's not just theory, it's not just speculation, but they have a lot of hard data, and that is exactly what their sponsors at the Department of Energy were looking for, Paul told us.
The primary question of the interest to the Department of Energy and why they funded this study is that peatlands like the one behind us, which occur throughout northern Minnesota and extensively throughout Canada, the northern European countries and Siberia, store 1/3 of the terrestrial carbon in the globe. And so the question becomes, if we're changing the climates under which those peatland stocks were stored and developed since last glaciation, in the case of northern Minnesota peatlands, what's going to be their fate? Are they going to stay there, or are they going to be released to the atmosphere as greenhouse gases, carbon dioxide and methane, and compound some of the issues that are driving climate change?
So it seems pretty clear why this is important, the significance of it, especially as we continue to have conversations about climate change and the effects of it and how it continues to become more and more of an issue unless something's done about it. But with that all being said, why do you think it fits in Northlandia? Because like we mentioned before, it's not our typical Northlandia beat. It's not, on paper, I wouldn't say this is like, oh, this is clearly a Northlandia story, but yet here we are.
I mean, it is certainly not the kind of quirky, eccentric project or phenomenon that we often talk about in this feature, but it is very unique to this region. This is not happening anywhere else. Nobody, to my knowledge, has ever tried anything quite like this sort of study of what happens when you've got a changing climate in a situation where you can take such large pieces of ecosystem and warm not just a plant or a few cells, but an entire, large area, and then do it multiple times over so you can study all sorts of different experimental conditions. So it's cool that this is happening at all, and it's happening here. And if you're just interested in interesting, totally distinctive things that you can go and see in our region, if that's like what you are hoping for when you follow our Northlandia feature, I'll tell you, put this at the top of your list because it's not going to be around that much longer. And you have never seen anything like this because there has never been anything like this. This kind of experiment, this kind of science just has not been done elsewhere. So it's definitely worth checking out. And on top of that, I think it speaks to a couple of other things that are distinctive about our region that people don't always appreciate. One is the emphasis on science, learning, care for the outdoors here. There's a reason we've got the national forest here. We've got the experimental forest within the national forest. So there's this long-standing, decades-standing commitment to forest science happening here in the region. So I think it speaks to our region's commitment to protecting and studying our forest areas. And then specifically, I think a lot of even Minnesotans who don't live in this area don't realize how much peatland there is in this region. I talked to tourists actually a couple weeks ago who were up. They were checking out the aerial lift bridge when I talked to them, but they were up here because they're kind of bog fans. They live in southern Minnesota. They hadn't even known that there is a huge bog area up here in northern Minnesota. And they're like, when we found that out, we decided to make a road trip and come see it. So it is a distinctive environment that we have here. And, I used the word rare earlier to refer to this environment. That's not precisely the case. It may be a little off the beaten path for where most Minnesotans go on their vacation or whatever. But in fact, there's a lot of peatland across the globe, which is what makes it such an important environment to understand with respect to what's going to happen to our planet in a warming future. I just think it's cool that, this is science that needs to happen. And it's cool that this is where it's able to happen because we have the environment and we have the support for it. And this project, although the news coming out of it is not exactly sunny, it's not, best case scenario in terms of what the future of our environment might look like, the science has been really successful. And so in that respect, this huge project that came here to the Northland has been a huge success. And it seems like everybody's really happy that they decided to go ahead with it.
All right, this has been a really interesting one. I'm walking away from this one feeling both enriched, enlightened, but also a little concerned and a little uncertain of what the future is going to look like in regards to our environment and our place in it. So this is quite an interesting, unique Northlandia.
Yeah, we use the term, science fiction. Honestly, what I was thinking when I was interested in this, and it really is, although it's science, it's not science fiction. It does have something in common with science fiction that I feel like in science fiction, you take what we know about the present and imagine a possible future. And if you're an author or you're a, filmmaker, that's all fictional. And you imagine, okay, how do I imagine the world will look and feel in the future? But these scientists are able to actually take a little area of land and say, okay, let's make this hotter. Let's make this the way we think it may be in the future. And you can step into that future in a sense when you walk into these enclosures and you can feel and you can see how our region could change in a warming future. And it's a little dystopian, but it's some cool science for sure.
Mm-hmm. All right, Jay. Well, I think we'll wrap it up there. I could probably make this much, much longer if I feel we could talk about this for a long time. So we probably just need to wrap it up at some point here. So I think we'll wrap it up here. Thank you again so much for joining us. Look forward to seeing what you have for us next time. I'm curious if we'll ever have another science fiction-y or real life science one like this, or if we'll kind of take a breather from the slightly dystopian, concerning, but also cool science.
Let's do something utterly fluffy and insignificant next time. I don't know. Have you seen any cool fairy tale dolls around the area?
Yep.
Oh, okay.
It's in the same area. Same area, though.
Yeah. And not insignificant, in fairness to that museum, which is cool.
Of course. And thank you for joining us on this venture into Northlandia. To read the article for this week's column, as well as see photos and video produced by myself, visit duluthnewstribune.com/topics/Northlandia. You can find all the episodes of Northlandia on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. If you or someone you know has a unique story that you believe can have a place here in Northlandia, let us know by emailing northlandia@duluthnew's.com. Join us again next time and discover the extraordinary stories that you just might miss if you're not in the right place at the right time, ready to step off the beaten path with no rush to return, here in Northlandia.